snapshot. The anchors are here. Number one says, explain how natural selection can impact allele frequencies of a population. Oof, they're using all the jargon, aren't they? Explain how natural selection can impact allele frequencies of a population. Organisms with the best alleles survive and reproduce. And remember, when they reproduce, they pass their alleles on to the next generation, right? And so let's see, what should we underline? We should say best alleles survive, that's the struggle to survive, right? And reproduce. Let's look at our picture here, okay? In number one, okay, this is meant to be a time lapse. Maybe we'll draw an arrow and we'll label it time, okay? In time period one, right, we've got light mice and dark mice both living in the same ecosystem, and that ecosystem appears to be dark, right? And so along comes a predator, the bird, right? And it looks like he's going to be good at consuming which mice? The light ones or the dark ones? The light ones, okay? And so the light ones are going to start to get killed off by the bird, right? And then later on, we see that the population has changed, right? Now there's more dark mice than there are light mice, right? And so that is a change in genetic makeup, which is what they mean when they say allele frequency. Change in genetic makeup. That's a change in allelic frequency. Allelic frequency just means the genetic makeup of a group of organisms of the same species living in the same place. Okay, is this evolution? Yes, this is evolution. And the means or the way that it's happening is by natural selection. The predator and the environment, whether it's dark or light, together, that determines what the gene pool of mice looks like. Does that make sense? Okay, let's go to the second anchor. Describe the factors that can contribute to development of a new species. For example, isolating mechanisms, genetic drift, founder effect, migration. Okay, let's just run through these words here. First one's genetic drift. The key word here is random. So in genetic drift, it's randomness. In natural selection, it's because of a predator or some factor in the ecosystem. It's not random, in other words. But in genetic drift, there's random deaths. So you can have this amazing species, this amazing specimen in the species. I always like to think about, the biggest buck deer that's out there, right? It's a 20-pointer. It can't even lift its head up. It's got so many points. But then it gets randomly hit by a truck, right? And so that changes the gene pool because now that buck's alleles or genes are no longer part of the gene pool. Migration. Remember, organisms that are mobile can go somewhere and they can take their alleles with them, right? And when they do that, that changes the genetic makeup of the gene pool or the population. Isolation mechanisms. Remember, we said isolation mechanisms mean that gene pools separate. So they become separated. That's what isolation means. And this allows the populations to diverge. Diverge means become different. Populations become different when they diverge. This is why we think there's special species on islands that don't exist anywhere else on the planet. Populations become different. Think Australia, right? Look at all the interesting species that live on Australia. They don't live anywhere else on the planet. What happens in Australia stays in Australia, right? What happens off of Australia is different than what's going on genetically on Australia. And then lastly, the founder effect. We didn't really talk about this very much, but a founder is the people that start something, right? And so when we start a new gene pool, there's a lot of inbreeding, okay? And so inbreeding leads to small genetic variation. Let's maybe just write a note inbreeding. So when you think of founder effect, think about inbreeding. The reason it's bad, well, there's many reasons, right? But the reason it's bad to inbreed is that you end up with offspring that are very similar to each other and the parents. And this can lead to recessive conditions that are bad and can affect the health of the population and the individuals that make up the population. So that's the founder effect. If you have a small population, there's going to be inbreeding, right? Because they're going to reproduce. They're just going to reproduce with their family, and that's not healthy. That leads to low genetic variation and can quickly cause the population to go extinct. Go ahead.
So the school mice, aren't they all inbred?
Yeah, that's a great question. So are you saying the school mice are inbred? Yeah, we try to minimize that, but it's something you have to be aware of. So like every year, we'll go and buy a couple of new male mice from a different place. We'll go to a pet store somewhere, and that introduces new genes. But you're right, we have to be careful for that. But yeah, that's a good thought.
I have an inbred
You have an inbred what?
guinea pig.
Guinea pig. How can you tell? What sort of problems does he have?
It came from an Amish pig.
It came from a what?
Amish pig.
Oh. It doesn't mean that he's inbred though, right?
Well, her dad is her, well,
Oh wait, are we talking about the guinea pig or the
guinea pig.
guinea pig? Okay, yeah, well I guess that is inbreeding, yeah. It's interesting that they know that. You can really keep track of their guinea pigs. I had a friend that raised guinea pigs. Yeah, I mean, she had like a shed in her backyard. You guys probably have sheds, right? She just threw down a bunch of hay and threw in some guinea pigs, and she raised them, and then she would sell them to pet stores. Her dad was part of the business model. He drove them all over Pennsylvania, and he, back of the pet store, here's your guinea pigs. What an interesting world, right? Okay, that's interesting though. Any problems with your guinea pig? Well, that's good. It's hard to say, right? I mean, you need a normal one to compare it to.
I have a normal one.
Okay, are they pretty much the same?
No, mine makes weird noises.
Okay. You know who's often inbred are dogs, right? If you have a purebred dog, like I have a boxer, the way that you get purebred dogs is usually through a lot of inbreeding, and that can be a problem, right? So that's why some breeds of dogs have certain kinds of problems, like boxers are known to have diabetes. That can be a problem for boxers because of the inbreeding. Ooh. Okay. Let's go to number 3. Explain how genetic mutations may result in genotypic and phenotypic variations within a population. Again, that's the state talking. Remember, mutation is any change in the DNA. So if you change the DNA, then you get new alleles. Most of the time we said those are bad alleles, right? Alleles that make you die, not alleles that make you better. But it's at least possible that you could get a new phenotype, and that could make you better at survival. We call those, I don't know why that line's there. We call those phenotypes that make you better at survival adaptations. Adaptations. Okay, number 4, we have to interpret evidence supporting evolution, fossils, anatomical and physiological, embryological, biochemical, and the universal genetic code. Remember, the key word here is evidence, right? So evidence is stuff that we look at, data that we look at, and we try to develop meaning for, right? We infer based on the data. And so what are some of the things we can look for? We can look for fossils. We all know fossils like the Carnegie Natural History Museum has for us, showing gradual changes in layers of rock from the deepest rocks to the most shallow. So remember, if we have a bunch of layers of rock, right, the ones that are deepest, if we find fossils down here, this is going to be, A is going to be older than B. That's the idea. Okay. Because B is more shallow, it must have died at a more recent time. Anatomical, we look for similarities in modern day structures. So we call some of these things homologous. You guys remember homologous means similar. We talk about homologous chromosomes all the time. Homologous structures are similar structures. So if we compare the bones found in a human arm to the bones found in a bat, there are some parallels. There's some similarities in terms of the bones. We're not saying they're exactly the same, obviously. A bat wing is a very different shape than a human arm. And then the last thing we can look for is biochemical similarities. And so remember, the idea is we look for the DNA between two different species, and we say, oh, if the DNA is very similar, then we expect that to be more recently divergent than something that has a lot of differences. And so the idea here, remember, if we have a phylogenetic tree, let's say this is species A, species B, species C, and we have time here, we would expect species A and C to have more things genetically similar than A and B, right? So A and C should have more similarities or more similar DNA than A and B. Okay. Any questions here? The universal genetic code that they mentioned, we talked about this back in protein synthesis, not in evolution, but all organisms have the same genetic code. But that doesn't mean that the DNA of a fish is the same as the DNA for a human, but what we mean is AUG, which is a codon, codes for methionine in all species. Right? It doesn't matter whether you're a fish or a human, AUG means methionine in all species. So that's the universal genetic code. And then the last one, distinguish between the scientific terms hypothesis, inference, law, theory, principle, fact, and observation. Basically, it's just a bunch of vocabulary words. Hypothesis, remember, a hypothesis is based on a theory, and it's an explanation about how something works that can be tested. So maybe we should jot down, has to be testable. A theory explains how something works. And so theories are what we do in science, right? We mostly focus on theories. How things work are theories. Theories can never be proven, but they have to be able to be falsifiable. There has to be a way to know if we are incorrect. So they must be falsifiable. A fact is something that can be observed, right? We can say, look, there it is. We can all agree what we're seeing there. Observation is anything that can be seen or measured. So observations are all about what we can see, or if we can't see it, but we can still measure it, we consider it to be an observation. An inference is a conclusion, or maybe sometimes we say it's the meaning of an observation. A law is what we observe to be true in nature. So laws are things that happen all the time that we can see in nature. Theories are not the same things as laws. Theories never become laws. Principles. A principle is a fundamental truth that is the foundation of a system of belief. So think of principles as your beliefs. And everybody has them. Even if you don't think you have them, you probably just haven't thought about it. Everybody has beliefs. Even if you're a person that says you don't have beliefs, that's a belief. So you're in a belief system. Okay? Any questions? Yeah, go ahead. Say again? Good question. Would a law start out as a theory? No. And here's why. Because laws are just what we see. It's just they're totally descriptive. Whereas theories are how or why something happens. So they do completely different things. Yeah. Okay. All right, well, let's go ahead and submit